everybody, and welcome to the next video. We are going to be exploring the basics of car setup in rFactor2 in this video. Although we are in rFactor2, some of these methods, explanations, whatever you want to call them, can be applied to other sim racing games as well, as majority of the sims do try to, at least to some degree, simulate the car handling and setup and so on. So they do apply to other games as well. We will be exploring the setup in the Oreca 07 LMP2 car. So some of the options might not be available for your car, or some of the options might be available for your car that aren't available for the Oreca. But we'll go through the explanation of these anyway. After the short walkthrough of the basics of the car setup, we are also going to be exploring what you can change and do to battle some of the situations, like for example corner entry understeer or corner exit oversteer or something. All the talks will be sectioned in YouTube, so you will be able to just choose the section that you are most interested in and just watch that. So yeah, I'm going to now stop the replay and go into the setup page, and I'll see you in a couple of moments actually. Alright, and here we are in the setup page for in the rFactor2 for the Oreca 07 LMP2 car. The main setup page is your basic setup, save and load thing. You can select a setup, load it. When you've done your changes, save it. You can copy it onto a new setup if you don't want to change the original. By clicking assign, you are assigning the selected setup to the car on this track, so which means whenever you will again load into this track, that setup will be primarily selected for you. If you don't have anything, it will be factory defaults, and that's pretty much it. You can also revert if you do any changes to the setup, so you can basically discard, which is pretty much exactly the same as just loading the same setup again. Compare what this does. It will show you the differences between your current setup and the setup you have selected while you were clicking on correct compare, sorry. Delete, well, it's pretty obvious. And defaults, I think it's also pretty obvious. It reverts back to the factory defaults. So it unloads your setup basically. You can copy in setups into the directories directly, and then just need to click refresh and it will load them up. So that's basic setup management. Of course, you also have notes that you can enter here. I think I have some. Yeah, I do have in this one. So when you save it, you can enter your notes, whatever you want, and it will show up in these boxes here. Anyway, next up is the powertrain setup. Here you have engine and electronics, gearing, automatic gearbox settings, and differential setting. Starting fuel, I think it's pretty obvious. It's how much fuel you want to put in your car. Rev limiter, if you have the option, you can change this to be higher or lower. Potentially, if you go higher, you will have potentially more power, but consume more fuel, for example, or run the engine a little bit hotter. Or if you go lower, it will be the opposite. Engine mixture, it's the fuel mixture for the engine. In the Oreca we have 4 settings, which is safety car, race lean, race, and qualification. Of course, qualification uses most of the fuel, but is also the quickest, while safety car is slower and uses less fuel. So if you want to fuel save or are behind a safety car, you can or you should use this engine mixture, so you can maybe prolong your standby another lap. In races, you will usually use race lean or race, again depending on how much you want to save your fuel. And next one, next two, actually we'll cover both of them, is the water radiator cover and oil radiator cover. Basically, radiators are very aerodynamically inefficient and they produce a lot of drag, but they are important to cool your engine. So you can close these down and your car will be less draggy, so it will slip through the air quicker, but your engine, your water and your oil will heat up more. So while doing your setup, do take note of your oil and water temperature and adjust these accordingly. But on the Oreca, you can safely run these at 75 both, sometimes even 100. It depends, of course, on the weather. Next three are the traction control settings. You can change. Oh, this is actually linked for the Oreca, the slip angle with the TC. And you cannot change it, but the TC power cut is separate. What the traction control does, it's, I think, very obvious to everyone. Basically, if the onboard computer detects that your wheels are about to spin, it will cut the power to and it will prevent the wheels from spinning. These settings then, of course, define how soon the traction control will kick in, and the cut is how much the traction control will kick in, meaning how much of the power will be reduced. Normally you want to run these in a similar number. Around 3 to 5 is sensible, I believe. The power cut can be either one higher or one lower. At least that's my personal preference on how to run them. Do note, however, I didn't know this, if you run the onboard traction control at full, so at 8 for the Oreca, it is super intrusive. You can hardly get on the power without it kicking in, and it will just slow you down like crazy. So do not advise to use 8. I think 6 should be really the highest that you want to go. But like I said, I usually run it between 4 or 5, maybe 3. We are not going to be touching regen because it's pretty much EV stuff, which I am unfamiliar with, so we're going to be skipping this and moving on to gearing. What the gearing does, it's defines the top speed. So the higher the speed on a gear, the less acceleration it has, and on the other way around. In the Oreca, I don't think we can change these in any setting. No, we can. We just have the ratio sets. But if you can adjust these how you want. Normally, you will want to be on the lookout if you have to shift up in a certain gear just before the braking point. That's the gear that you might want to adjust a little bit, be it higher or lower. Usually higher, so that the gear is extended a little bit, so you are not required to shift up right before the braking zone, because it's it's just frustrating. You have to shift up and then immediately brake and shift down again. So that you can control this with gearing if you have the option of setting the gear ratio separately. Then the final gear, basically what the final gear does is adjusts the whole gear set, which we cannot set in this car either. So you can either make all of the gears a little bit longer, meaning you will have a little bit more top speed. So if you're hitting the rev limiter before the longest straight, you might want to change the final gear to make everything a little bit longer. Or if you're not reaching the limiter, even when in a draft on the long straight, on the longest straight, you might want to make the gears a little bit shorter, so you have a little bit more acceleration. Okay, automatic gearbox. Going to skip this one as well, because I literally have no clue what these should do, as I'm not usually driving automatics in sim. And we are going to go on to differential. And just to get this torque split out of the way, again, I've never really driven a four-wheel driven car, which this setting is for, but so I don't know how to adjust it, but I do know it basically defines how much torque you want on the front tires versus the rear tires. pretty much that's what the description there says, and yeah, that's pretty much it. Then we have differential settings, power, coast, and preload. What these control is basically how long or how quickly the tires are locked together in rotation, so the driven tires. And the preload basically defines how much of a torque difference there has to be between the left and the right driven tire before the differential starts unlocking and allowing the tires to rotate at different speeds. Mainly in the Oreca, I run this between 20 and 50 in the extremes. On other cars, it can be a little bit different. When you go lower on the preload, you will usually have more oversteer going into the corner and more understeer when going out of the corner. If you go higher, of course, the opposite is true for that. Then power and coast basically control the same thing, except for each phase of the corner separately. So coast will control how your car behaves on corner entry. If you go lower on the setting, your car will be more nervous into the corner. It will rotate more. If you go higher, it will rotate less, so it will be more understeery when entering a corner. Those differences are really minor, so that's pretty much the last thing that you are going to be changing in terms when setting up the car. And of course, the power is the behavior of the differential when you are exiting the corner. So having it set to less, the car will rotate more on exit, so it will produce more oversteer on exit, while setting it up higher, it will be more understeery on exit. So if you're losing the rear and corner entry, you just want to maybe set this one a little bit higher. Or if you're washing out too much, you might want to try and reduce this a little bit to get that little bit more extra rotation when you're exiting the corner. All right, that was Powertrain. And next up, we have wheels and brakes. First things first, left and right, you can unlock these, so you can change the values separately if you so wish to do so, but I've never had a situation where I would need to do this. Maybe in some other cars this comes handy, but in the Oreca it certainly hasn't come handy so far. Rear and front wheels are pretty much the same, so we'll just do one. Compound is the tire compound, what you want to run. So in Oreca you have soft, medium, hard, and rain. Rain you usually want to run when it's wet, of course. Hard will give the least grip while lasting the longest, and soft will give you the most grip while being destroyed the quickest, and medium is somewhere in between. Then we have tire pressure, which is at 180 kPa, kilopascal units, and in rFactor2 on at least on the DLC cars, what you want to do, which is I still find extremely funny, is always run them at minimum, front and back. So 140 is the minimum value. That's what you want to go with. But in general, what the tire pressure does control is the temperature of the tire, so the distribution of between outer layer, middle layer, and the inner layer of the tire. So if your tire is overinflated, it will balloon up a little bit, and the middle patch of the tire will be more in contact than the outer edges. And on the inverse, if you go too low, your outer edges will, the tire will sag, so the middle tier of the tire will bend up slightly, so it will be less in contact, and your outer edges will heat up more, while the middle will be a bit cooler. But in rFactor2 for the DLC cars, at least at the current version, that doesn't matter. You just run it at minimum, and that's it. It's a broken thing, but what can you do? maybe if your tires are running too hot, you can increase the tire pressure a little bit, but certainly don't go a lot higher. Then camber. Camber is basically how the tires are leaning at the top edge. So if you're looking at the car from the front, that front, what the camber controls, it's how much the upper side of the tire is leaned in towards the inside, toward the middle of the car. The bigger the negative value, the more it's leaning inward. But in rFactor2 on the Oreca, what I usually start off when building a setup is negative 1.5 degrees, which is the most negative on the front, and 0.9 in the rear. This seems to be the quickest, but it can sometimes destroy tires. So what I usually end up running is a value somewhere on front between 2.1 and 1.9, and on the rear I usually go up to like 1.4, 1.5, 1.3, something along the lines. Brake disc. Cannot change this. This is the thickness of the brakes. If your brakes are overheating and you have this option, you can maybe make them a little bit thicker, and this should help dissipating the heat. And yeah, of course, thicker the heavier. So that's the downside. But in this car, we don't have that option. Brakes. Brake bias is basically how much of that brake force is being transferred to the front tires versus the front tire versus the rear tires. So at 60-40, this will mean 60% of the brake force will go to the front tires, 40% will go to the rear tires. I like to run this at around 53% on the front tires and 47 to 48 on the rear tires. What this can affect the handling of the car. Basically, the more brake force you have on the rear, when you brake, the weight will shift forward in the car, so more weight will be on the front of the car, so the light will be lighter. The rear will be lighter, which means it will be easier to lock up the rear tires, and it can produce a nervous car on corner entry, especially when you're trail braking into the corner, because the rear is being lighter, and if the rear locks up for a split second, it can jank your car into an oversteer moment, or you can even lose control. So if you're feeling like you're losing control too quickly, maybe move the brake balance a little bit forward. Or if you're locking the fronts too much, you can try moving the brake balance a little bit rearward. Maximum pedal force is just what this means, which means if you have this at 100%, so when you press the pedal fully, it will be 100 kilograms of braking force applied to the brakes, which I don't think you want in the Oreca, because you will be locking your tires all the time. I usually run this at around 97, 98, maybe 96 kilograms of force, depending on the track. This is more a personal preference than anything else. So if you find yourself locking up way too much, just go and reduce this, but not too much, because at high speed, especially in high downforce cars, you will want to have a lot of braking force, because at high speeds it will be unlikely that you will be locking up your tires, as the downforce is pushing your car into the ground. But at lower speeds, you can lock up quickly, and that's why I want to maybe reduce this. Front and rear brake duct blanking. Brake ducts are there to help cool the brakes, and as the radiator, they are very draggy. So what you want to do is close them up slightly. how much depends on the weather and the track. If you have a lot of slow corners following, or long straights following slow corners, where you need to brake a lot, your tires will be heating up very quickly and often. Maybe you will want to maybe run this at lower values. But if you have a fast flowing track, you can close these up really well and still have cool brakes, especially if you have long straights, like for example in Le Mans, where you do have time to cool off your brakes. You can run this easily at 25 on the front and close on the rear, or even 50 on the front. Of course, it also depends on the weather, so do take note of that. Drive a couple of laps, look at your brake temperatures. And in the Oreca, what you want to aim for is to reach around 920 maybe degrees centigrade when braking heavily, but you don't want to exceed this too much. And yeah, that's wheels and brakes. All right, then moving on to suspension and aero. Maybe let's get the aerodynamics out of the way first. If you have the front splitter adjustable, you can adjust how much aero is produced by the front splitter. Of course, more means more downforce, but more drag. And the higher effect of this is on the rear wing. It produces a lot more drag, and it also produces a lot more downforce. So usually on the Oreca, I run this just at 1. If I'm having real difficulties, I will up it to 2 to get more aero stability. But yeah, usually you want the lower value because the car itself is producing a lot of downforce by itself without the wing even. So 1 is usually enough. All right, front and rear suspension. Again, linkable, so you can detach this if you want to. But yeah, again, never had to use this before. So the spring rate controls the stiffness of the springs. The stiffer the springs, the harder they are to compress. The less the car will lean to the front if the springs are stiffer when braking. If you want to induce more corner entry oversteer, you want the front to be a little bit softer, so the car will dive a little bit more, the fronts will grip up a little bit more, and your car will be turning in a little bit more easier. On the rear, it's the same thing. Basically, if you are losing the rear on acceleration, you might want to go and reduce the rear spring stiffness. So when you are accelerating, the rear of the car will sit in a little bit more, so the tires will grip up a little bit more, and you will be able to exit the corner a bit more safely without that much wheel spin. You might want to think, why just not run the minimum values on front and back? Yeah, no, you don't want to do that, because the car will just feel like it's floating all over the place. It won't be direct on turn-in. And you will be bottoming out more easily, so you'll have to run the ride height a little bit higher, and yeah, you don't want to do that. Then we have the tender spring. The tender spring is usually a softer spring attached to the regular suspension spring. On the Oreca, you don't have this adjustable, but what this is used for is to help the tire follow the track a little bit more, or in high-speed situations where you would want to want the car to sink into the ground a little bit more, especially in ground effects, for example, so that you will create a bigger seal on the floor. But on the Oreca, again, we don't have that one. Then we have packers and spring rubber, which are pretty much the same thing, except the spring rubber is a soft material, a packer is a hard material. And what this is basically like a washer on top of the spring, and this prevents the full spring length to be compressed fully, and basically this helps from the bottom hitting the ground. If your suspension is set up too soft, so this will give you a little bit less suspension travel in your car. The third spring is kind of a similar thing. Basically, what this is used is on high downforce cars usually. In the Oreca, we only have the third spring on the front, or at least it's controllable only on the front. And this is works kind of like a packer, but it's a spring. It's not a hard stop, but it's like a softer stop, controllable soft stop. If you're bottoming out on the front a lot, you can set up the spring. As you can see, this one is a little bit stiffer. You can, of course, detach it completely if you're not bottoming out, and yeah, this will help you a lot, because when both tires are being bumped up by or lifted up by a bump, the third spring is activated, so to speak, and that spring is the one that absorbs this hit, and instead of the softer springs that are more in play when cornering. Then we have ride height. Is basically what the name suggests, is how high you want front and rear to be riding along. You want this as low as possible without bottoming out. If you're bottoming out at high speeds only, that's fine. If you're bottoming out always and over the curbs and you're having difficulties with that, you might want to raise the front a little bit. The rear should always be higher than the front. The higher the rear, or the bigger the difference between front and rear, the more rotation you will get through the corner. But too much will induce too much rotation, and of course you will lose traction in the rear and spin out. And then we have settings on the front suspension and the rear suspension. Anti-roll bar is basically a bar between the left and right, and it's resisting car roll. So the stiffer the roll bar, the more the roll is resisted. The more the car will be level through the corner, and the front and rear anti-roll bars are pretty much my go-to settings that I change when fighting oversteer or understeer, depending on the phase of the corner. So if I'm having understeer when entering a corner, I will reduce the front anti-roll bar, so I will allow the car to roll a little bit more into the corner in the front, and thus help it with traction on the front. And the same goes on the rear. In rFactor2 on the Oreca, when you're doing a setup, usually you want to start with the detached rear anti-roll bar when setting everything up and work from there. I'm not saying you're going to be running this in a detached state. Usually you don't, but this is where you want to start. Then you start stiffening it more and more. And the last setting in suspension and aero, we have toe in. Toe in, what basically, if you now try to look at the car from the top down, toe in controls how much the front of the tires are pointing towards each other on the front of the front of the tire. And if you go those are negative values, of course. So the higher the negative value, so minus 94 degrees, this will be like a 1 degree. Both the tires will be turned in towards themselves. So the left tire will be turned to the right a little bit. The right tire will be turned to the left a little bit. The opposite, so the positive, is exactly the opposite. So the left tire will be facing left a little bit, and the right tire will be facing right a little bit. So the front of the tires will be facing outward a little bit. What this does, if you have a negative value, that side of the car, so the front or the back, will be a little bit more nervous. On the fronts, you usually want these in the negative numbers, usually around minus 14, minus 10, something like that. And this helps with car turn-in, because the car wants to turn in a little bit more on that edge. And on the rear, you do want the toe out, so that the front of the tires are facing outward a little bit. Why you want that is to get a little bit more stability on the rear, but don't go crazy with these values, because the higher the value, the more the tire is being dragged across the ground, and it's producing more heat, basically, and you might not want to do that. Usually the rear, I run it at 0. Maybe I'll go to a negative 0.06, sorry, in qualification. But in race, I will usually run either 0 or 0.06, 0.012 on the rear. And that is suspension and aero. All right, and next up is dampers. We don't have dampers controllable on the third spring in the Oreca. Maybe you do, but yeah, we don't. Again, left and right are detachable if you want to, but again, never had to do that. Then we have 4 general settings: slow bump, slow rebound, fast bump, and fast rebound. What this controls is the level of dampening, level of slowing down the travel in that direction nicely without that harsh stop. This is slowly stopping it in each direction. The slow and fast are basically, the slow is resisting body roll from braking or from turning side to side or front to rear, and the fast settings are for bumps, basically when you run over a bump in the road, over the curb or something, and that's what you're controlling with it. So the softer slow bump will mean that you are allowing the car to roll forward quicker and not come to a nicer, not come to an abrupt stop. And what this means, if you allow the car to pitch forward a little bit more when applying the brakes, it of course means more oversteer on corner entry. So if your car is understeering, you want the slow bump to be lower on the front. And then we have slow rebound, which is the opposite of the bump. So the bump controls when the suspension is traveling downward, and the rebound is basically when the suspension is traveling upward. So in the slow rebound controls on the front how quickly or how much dampening you want on the suspension travel upward, which happens when you are accelerating. So if for example you're losing the grip and the rear at corner exit, you want a softer slow rebound, so you will allow the front to rise quicker, and inversely you will then also have a quicker sag on the rear and more traction on the rear, so we'll be able to exit the corner a little bit nicer. And as said before, fast bump and fast rebound are exactly the same, only they happen over curbs or bumps in the road. They control the very same things though. And that's a quick run through on dampers. And now moving on to chassis, where in Oreca we don't have a lot to control. The dive plane is controllable when you're selecting the car already, and you cannot adjust it here. Basically, the dive plane are the canards on the side of the front. Different dive planes are either producing more drag and more downforce, or less drag and less downforce. Caster is maybe a little bit hard to explain, but it's basically how the steering rack is angled onto the tire. It's not adjustable in this car, but basically the negative value will mean that the top is sitting a more backward towards the back of the car. If you look at the car from the side profile, the top of the steering rack is angled a little bit more backward, and thus when you are turning the wheel, the geometry of the wheel, also the camber of the wheel at turn-in is changing, and the more negative value you have on the caster, the steering will feel heavier, and the more camber will be applied to the tires when you are turning in. Lower caster can help somewhat with a front tire grip, but not by a lot, but not adjustable in this car, unfortunately, as it does help with defining how heavy the steering feels for your car. Then we have front and rear wheel track adjustment, which I'll be honest, I don't know much what this does, but what the effect is. But basically, you define how spread apart the tires are. I don't know what would be the downside, but the more the wider they are, the more stability you should be having through the corners. Wheel lock is basically how much wheel range on your steering wheel you want to have before you reach full lock. The lower the value means that you will get to full lock quicker. Means you will have to do softer and less wheel input to turn the tires more, while more will mean the inverse. So if you're feeling like you're all over the road, set this a little bit higher so that you'll be a little bit more in control of your car. Weight distribution is basically how you want, if you have the option, how you want that weight distributed in the car, front to back, left to right, to help with stability of the car. I never had to play with this, so I will just skip over this part. And that's pretty much it for the chassis. And last but not least, we have pit stops, which is just defining how much pit stops you want and how much fuel you want in each pit stop. Nothing fancy there. And that is a basic walkthrough of the rFactor2 setup. There's nothing much to say on this. So we will be looking at some potential problems that you're having on track and how to resolve them in the next couple of sections. So please bear with me. Okay, so you've done your setup changes, you've done a couple of laps, and you are now seeing that you're having difficulties on the track with your setup. So first thing, a couple of words on how to do setup changes is make small iterations. Do not make big changes or a lot of changes because you will not know which setting caused what later. So I usually suggest doing just one at a time in small iterations, and then go out, do again a couple of laps, 3-4 laps, just to kind of reset your muscle memory as well a little bit, because the car might be behaving now a little bit differently and you might need to adjust your driving in certain corners. So do give it a couple of laps before getting back into the pits and changing stuff again. And I cannot stress this enough, small changes. Do not make any big changes. If you're having to click more than 5 times, you're way beyond the line already. If you've made some changes and you're worried that you won't remember what to change back because you've messed something up, I advise saving in between. You can use a bit more descriptive naming scheme like I did here, or make use of the setup notes. All right, those are a couple of words on how to make setup changes. All right, so now you've been out on the track, you've done a couple of laps, and now you are finding yourself having difficulties when entering the corners. You just cannot get the car turned in, it just refuses to turn in. And yeah, so what I do first is the most efficient way to help the car turn in is to reduce the rear wing. This will help definitely. The car will be more nervous at the rear now, and you should be turning in a little bit quicker. That's the first thing I would suggest to do. The other thing, the other major thing on the suspension that you want to do is either increase the front toe in, so have it a more negative value, although I'm already having it at minus 18 here, so that's already a lot. The toe in will particularly help more in slower corners, while the rear wing will help more in quicker corners. And generally you want a softer front on the suspension, so either this is already the softest settings on the anti-roll bar. You basically want a softer anti-roll bar, particularly in the quick corners, or in majority or in most of the corners you want to have the softer spring rate at the front. So go ahead and reduce that. Third spring, yeah, I'm going to be honest, I usually don't run it at all, or run it at this setting, but it doesn't affect turn in all that much. Front right height, you want it lower. You want it to go lower, again depending if you're bottoming out or not, how low you want to go, or just raise the rear, although don't go too crazy on this. I don't like to run more than about 2.5 to 3 centimeters difference between the front and the rear. That's already that's kind of the upper limit I find on the Oreca. Next thing you can do is, like we've already done here, reduce the slow bump, let the car sink in a little bit more, and let the rear come up a little bit quicker. And this will definitely induce a little bit more oversteer coming into the corners. And on the brakes, especially if the corner requires you to trail brake into it, what you can do is move the brake bias a little bit backward. So lower first number, higher second number. This is extreme, but you get the picture. Yeah, this will definitely help you rotate around the corner when you are entering it. But as stated before, small iterations, don't go too crazy. What can help somewhat is also front camber. So reduce it, so higher negative number will help you turn in a little bit as well, or just generally have a bit more front end grip around the corner. And one final thing, like I said before, the preload, run it lower to get more turn in on corner entry, or reduce the coast setting on the differential. This will help you with rotation while you are coasting into the corner. And those are pretty much in order as I try to do them when making my setup changes when I have difficulties with turning the car into the corner. And one final thing is fighting oversteer on the exit of corners. What you want to do, or what I usually do. First, what I will try is reduce the anti-roll bar on the rear to get to allow the car to roll a little bit more to the outside when you're accelerating out. So it will maybe help with grip on the rear. Softer rear suspension. Maybe this can help to a degree as well, or actually that will help when exiting the corner, most definitely. And maybe a click or two of rear packers to prevent the car from bottoming out at the rear. Maybe that's also a problem. Ride height, if you can go lower, try to go lower. You want more grip on the end. So when you have the rear a little bit lower in comparison to the front, I mean not below the front, but less difference, let's say it like that, the more the floor aerodynamic pressure is shifted to the back, and the more the back is sucked down to the ground. Again, you don't want to go too much low on this because you can affect, of course, then the corner entry, which is again not something that you want. And dampers, same thing again. Maybe reduce slow rebound on the front, slow bump on the rear, and this should help you a lot. If you are on the exit and the exit of the corner is bumpy, you want to reduce the fast bump and fast rebound settings on the front and rear as well. What else? Differential, you can set the preload higher, and if you're having oversteer on exit, you will want to set up the power setting a little bit higher, which will allow the differential to open more on power on the exit and allow you to exit the corner a little bit nicer. Of course, TC can also help if you're feeling like you're spinning your tires a bit more, but like I said, stay away from 8. Definitely stay away from 8. That's not what you want to do. But be careful with the TC, because you can set it up that it will kick in too quick and you will just lose speed on corner exits, which I'm sure you don't want to do. And that is then corner exit oversteer. And with that, yeah, I will thank you all for watching. If you found this guide informative, please do leave it a like. And if you want more of such things, please subscribe to the channel. It really does mean a lot. And yeah, I will see you in the next video. Thank you everyone for watching. Have an awesome day, night, evening, morning, wherever you are. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.